Hi, everyone. Welcome. We are delighted to have you join us for the latest installment of the CLAPR Distinguished Speaker Series. Today's guest is Professor Joe Tafoya, who I'll be handing the mic over to momentarily. I'm present in person, and soon you will see him along with the slide deck. Let me just mention that Professor Tafoya comes to us today by way of DePaul University. And I'm especially proud to be hosting him today because he's going to be sharing some insight on civic engagement and Latino political empowerment. And what is especially important, and one thing that I want to share, is that I've seen Professor Tafoya develop as a scholar from his days as an emerging scholar in his undergraduate years through graduate school, and now delighted to host him as someone who's on tenure track doing amazing work in teaching and research in the Chicago area. I'll let him share the title of his presentation here momentarily, and then we expect for the talk to go about 20 to 25 minutes, leaving ample room for those of us in the audience online as well as in person to engage with Professor Tafoya with some questions and comments at the end. All right, thank you.
Oh, okay. Okay. Awesome. Well, thank you very much, Professor Francisco Pedraza. First and foremost, I'd like to extend my deepest gratitude to ASU and the CLAPR program for bringing me here. Professor Rodney Hero, Professor Francisco Pedraza. The two of you have been two scholars that I have looked up to and followed your work closely, admired your conferences, and I'm very delighted to be here to share some insights to some of my work that I've been up to in the Chicago area. First and foremost, before I get started, just describe a little bit about myself. My name is Professor Dr. Joe Robert Tafoya. I come from East Los Angeles, California. Right, so I'm no stranger to the Southwest, but I love this area. Happy to be back. Awesome area. There in East Los Angeles in 2006, as a high school student, I led a walkout from Garfield High School, which has a history in student blowouts, and all the way back to the 1960s, student activism. In that moment, it guided my interest in Latino politics and Latino political empowerment, who we are as a community developing the American political system. From there, I went to UT Austin to get my doctorate. I worked with Professor David Al, Jessica Sayas, and then some folks in American politics and public opinion, like Darren Shaw, Bob Luskin, Chris Hoyt, awesome people. Very, very indebted to them. At DePaul University, I work in the Department of Political Science. I am the sole Latinx Latino faculty member their department. And we are blessed at DePaul to have a standalone center for Latino research called the Center for Latino Research. The university has devoted a fair amount of resources for Latino research spanning many disciplines. And from there, I was able to develop an international collaboration with Professor Yuriko Takahashi, who is the co-author for this presentation. She is from Waseda University, Japan. Professor Takahashi showed up to DePaul, presenting some research she had done in Mexico City, and looking at political participation north of the border in places like San Diego, Riverside, and Chicago. She and I connected, and we were able to identify a very significant gap in the literature in political science, and some of that research I'll be presenting to you today. The talk for my presentation. All right. The title for the talk today from my presentation is "Mobilizing the Politically Invisible: Political Participation and the Unlisted Latino Population." Oh, yes. Mobilizing the politically invisible, political participation and the enlisted Latino population in Chicago. This project was originally conceived for presentation at the 2024 Western Political Science Association and the panel of Reaching Marginalized Communities. We also wish to thank WPSA for its generous support and amazing feedback on this presentation. Okay. So the roadmap for the presentation today, I will be walking you through some of the ins and outs of our project. More than anything, what I'm looking for, what I'm seeking in the presence here is feedback from both the students and the experienced faculty in this research project in terms of directions, in terms of where to take the project, more importantly, how to tighten some of the conceptual constructs that we're using. here to make obviously some, pretty insightful conclusions about Latinos in the political system. So firstly, we'll be talking about, describing the international collaboration with my colleagues from Japan. We'll also describe full support from DePaul's Center for Latina Research, like I said, significant amount of resources. And then I'll get into the meat of the matter, right? The focus, prominence of Latinos in this new category that we call politically invisible. So I'll be describing what the category is, just how many Latinos do we find in that category. As well, I'll be describing some results from survey research, where we're able to derive and determine that Latinos classified as politically invisible have very few relevant political resources. We also have conducted a focus group interview, right there where we describe and propose the system of respondent-driven sampling. This is to get around some pretty well-known issues in sampling cartoons population, right? So what is there an improvement, right, to the small ball sampling technique? How do we get a broader scope and understanding of how big the population is? As well, I'll be describing some GOTV, Get Out the Vote campaigns that took place in Cook County earlier this year for the 2024 Illinois primary. From there, we'll be deriving some insights about high Latino areas and their political character. And more than anything, we are seeking feedback for this project. Any feedback is welcomed in terms of the presentation, the conceptual grasp, the setup, anything you'd like to offer, we will happily accept. Right, so what the study does is it revisits low voting by Latinos in the United States. Those of us interested in Latinos, Latino politics, every time there's an election, time in, time out, we are concerned about Latino voter turnout. The media focuses on the narrative of the sleeping giant, right? That at some point the Latino population is going to wake up and exercise its political muscle. And election after election, pundits are disappointed. Right? We tend to, say, well, that didn't work. What's wrong with the Latino population? So there, the narrative obviously becomes one of deficiency, right? One of, Latinos aren't doing what they're supposed to be doing, right? Here, what I note in the aggregate voter turnout data is that in the recent presidential elections, the gap in turnout, propensity for Latinos to turn out, is quite large compared to the voter turnout for white and African Americans. Consistently, election after election, and I'll show you a graph in a little bit describing this gap and showing you how big it is. We see that the Latino community nationwide loses between 13 to 20% in the presidential election of 2020, presidential election of 2016 between 15 to 20% in terms of voter turnout, right? Here I started with the presidential election of 2020 because it was a big election, right? So many of us were worried about the outcome. We were worried about the health of democracy, right? We had record voting across all groups, including Latinos, right? Latino voting was up to 53%. However, that gap, right, was persistent, right? Some would say stubborn. So here we're going to deal with some of that, right? Here for the motivations, just sort of describing a little bit more in detail, right, how this gap has shaped, in recent elections. We see that the gap between Hispanic voting and non-Hispanic white and non-Hispanic voting is quite big. But more than anything, it's quite consistent. Right? If you look at the gap in voting in 2008, 2012, 2016, let's say in 2020, we're talking about 15 to 20% points, right? Where the Latino community is basically participating at rates less than the non-Hispanic population that are white and black. But also what's important is that Latino voting has consistently been below 50%, right? That means less than 1 in 2 eligible Latinos are voting, right? That changed in 2020 when we had 53% voter turnout. That was the first time the Latino, nationwide Latino voting nationwide went above 50%. However, voting for other groups also went up, right? So there again, we have that persistent, stubborn gap. All right, so here's the motivation for the study, right? What we wanted to do, Rico Takahashi and I wanted to know is basically what are we missing? What are some insights that we are missing about Latino voting? Right? What don't we know, in relation to the survey literature based on what we do know? All right, so here we started with what we know, right? What we know about voters is focused on the characteristics and the resources that they possess. Right, first and foremost, if you look at the sort of the three-legged stool in terms of civic participation according to robust philosophy and rating, we have resources that are essential, motivation is essential for voting, and mobilization networks are also essential. Right, we see in the literature pretty prominently reported that across all three levels or all three factors that are essential for voting, Latinos are low, systematically low, or lower, than the average population in terms of resources, right? In terms of motivation, here we're talking about political knowledge, interest in politics. And we're also talking about low access to mobilization networks, right? Folks like Melissa Michelson and Ramirez in 2013 are describing to us that the mobilization networks are, there's much to be desired. And the focus on raising voting and identifying what is missing, right, has been a topic of more recent literature in the last few years, right, in terms of Latino politics. We're focused on context, right, how Latinos in high Latino areas tend to be more politically knowledgeable, right, how outreach, right, particularly by the Democratic Party, leaves much to be desired, and Asians and Latino immigrants are left out, right? And Melissa Michelson and Valenzuela also described to us that we need to think about where we're using mobilization techniques because they might be more receptive in some communities over others. Lastly, with emotional relief, here is where I, sort of broadly encapsulated the literature on political threats, right? And how threatening environments might motivate people to get involved in politics, right? And here, the last point of the slide, despite Trump on the ballot, right? Here, we're thinking of Donald Trump as a quintessential boogeyman, right? To Mexican American, to populations in the United States of immigrant descent, right? Despite him being on the ballot in 2016 and 2020, the disadvantages that we see in Latino voting remain. Right? So we didn't have this large rush of voters, right, to the polls when Trump was on the ballot. I mean, we did have it in 2020, but again, it rose for the rest of the non-Latino population. So what we wish to do is to propose a framework of political invisibility. Right, what we're looking for here is a systematic factor that accounts for this persistent gap in Latino voting. Right, much of the literature has been focused on individual level factors, where things like fear, right, things like like the comfort that one feels in one's community, right, these individual level factors. We believe limit a conversation about the broader systematic factors that could explain why Latinos are turning out to polls less so than the non-Latino population. So here in our literature review, right, for the paper, where we consider models of voting, we're really kind of taking into consideration what political science knows. We identify what we're missing. Right, with the civic volunteerism model, by Berger, Schlossman, and Brady, right, we have resources, psychological engagement, and recruitment networks. There's an emphasis upon skills developed in a lifetime, and those with privilege have greater advantage of holding these skills. So this is the issue when we have Latinos in lower paying jobs, lower educational attainment, and of course being younger in age, are they going to be predisposed to voting a lot, right? The latent class model describes 4 ideal types of political participation: standard participants, protesters, non-participants, and non-interest. Right, the literature on this model of voting describes that the socioeconomic model of voting, the standard model of voting, applies to standard participants. Bobo and Gilliam Jr. described to us that African Americans typically belong to the protest class of people who are involved in politics. Therefore, the mobilization strategies, right, and the understanding of how voter turnout is shaped, right, has to be nuanced, right, has to be tailored to the experience of a particular group. Lastly, the social capital model. We are all familiar with Robert Putnam's work, right? It talks about family, religion, racial identity, and region where one resides as important factors for mobilization. The social networks are invaluable for individuals. Right here, we love this last point here because it allows the research to look into Latino groups. Right, again, shifting away the focus from individual level factors, right, to broader systematic community, these broader, larger factors that could shape the voter turnout, right, where trust is developed and confidence returns. Right, so what we propose to do here, our contribution is to effectively apply the social cognition model of voting to understanding Latino voter turnout. Right, this idea that we get from Lisa Garcia Bedoya and Melissa Michelson, 2012, in their book, mobilizing inclusion, transforming the electorate through GOTU campaigns. They describe that voting is not an isolated system, right? That frequently literature and political science describes, right, the trade-offs that individuals make. They're oftentimes thinking about their pocketbook. Right here, we are reconceptualizing voters as part of members of social networks, right, that shape individuals. Right, social context affects access to resources. More importantly, cognitive processes shape interpretation of available information. Right, this is where we develop tailored, specific explanations, right, for a population, for a group, right, to really understand what they're missing, to be able to give them what they need. Right, one of the things we want to give them, right, is this intervention. This is us, trying to sort of introduce a stimulus into the calculus of the decision to vote. Right, we're very interested in the idea of lived civics and how scholars nowadays, there are some new scholars, particularly DePaul, who are teaching classes in lived civics and organizing people into focus groups like classrooms. Right, so that people can learn about civics, they can learn from each other, they can learn about where to vote, how to vote, who to vote for. Right, there are some tried and true proven narratives, right, that allow students, young people, to develop the importance in their minds, right, to feel like they are important members of society, right. Here are some questions: do they matter? Will anyone care? And we need to really provide intervention that uplifts this feeling of self-worth. Right, we're really interested in doing that. Right now, the issue that we're dealing with right now, right, we're talking about political invisibility, is that we're dealing with people who are effectively outside of our known purview when it comes to explanations of voters, when it comes to the characteristics that voters possess, right? So here, basically what I'm trying to say is that we are dealing with hard to reach populations, right? Issue number one is that the tools that we're using, by definition, aren't going to happen. All right, so what we propose is the methodological innovation of respondent-driven sampling, RDS for short. RDS is an awesome new method that I would say is a modified version of snowball sampling, right? That allows us to get the sense of the size and the reach of a particular network or a particular community, right? By identifying individuals, and those individuals connect us with more individuals, and then finally reporting metadata, right? About the size of the networks, right? To generate a probabilistic sampling method, right, of the probability that people have being selected to participate in the sample, right? So we are attempting to apply some pretty interesting methods. RDS has also been used for getting comprehensive samples of HIV-infected populations in Africa, right? Hard to reach populations where divulging your status as a vulnerable, marginalized person could be dangerous, right? Here what I have is a little bit of Talavera as a palate cleanser. Okay, so we just went through a whole lot. I'm going to describe to you then our first study, right? The first study and the insights thereof. Right, so part one, survey research. So one of the things that we did, right, in order to get to know the politically invisible population, is recreate analysis on the politically invisible population by span and, I have the citation up here, sorry. Just give me a sec. I promise I won't do this. Jackman and Span, Politically Invisible America 2021. Right, so what Jackman and Span realized is that the information available to campaigns, they can use to mobilize voters, right, that information can be underlined. It's not complete. More importantly, there is information that is incorrect or outdated. So Jackman and Span 2021 asked, what is the rate of political invisibility? More importantly, what is the rate of people who are mislisted, who are unlisted, and therefore invisible to political campaigns? Now, that information is made available by vendors of voter data, right? It's either collected through county records or through market research. Right, so a lot of that information, right, is like extrapolated. We're filling in gaps. Some of the methods are unknown, right? Luckily, the American National Election Study provided voter validation data, right, to us. So here we're trying to match an individual voter with their observed behavior. Did you vote? Did you not vote? More importantly, we're able to classify people, right, as to whether the record of their voting, of their registration file, is accurate. So our recreation of the Jackman and Span study, right, led us to identify the various categories, right, that Americans fall into when it comes to their voter information data being made public, being utilized by campaigns. Of course, we have valid records, authentic records of people who are registered, people who are unregistered, right? These populations, if you look at white Americans, for the registered population, that's 75%, right? So for white Americans, their records are largely intact, they're largely active. Right, when you look at the Black and Latino population, those numbers fall to 58% and 53%. Right, so here off the bat, we're getting to nearly half of the records available for Black and Latino respondents, right, are inactive. Right, that means that when campaigns want to call them up and tell them to vote for a particular initiative or a particular campaign or candidate, right, they're going to be reaching the wrong person. They're going to be getting a wrong phone number. And in many cases, if you go all the way down to the instance of people who are unlisted, these folks won't appear on those records. So here, row 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, depending on how you count down, second from last. Here we added the tabulations for the mislisted and the unlisted. And here we note that the general conclusion, right, that 18 to 20% of the American population is invisible. We note that that conclusion nearly doubles when it comes to Black. Right, so off the bat, we have a larger instance of political invisibility. Here, the tagline says, Blacks and Latinos are underrepresented in registered categories and overrepresented in mislisted and unlisted. Right? Now, my empirical analysis recreating the Jackman and Span study allowed me, because of the replication files that are available online, allowed me to provide estimates, point estimates for the Latino Hispanic population in the US, to really be able to identify, okay, what kind of politically relevant resources to the mislisted, unlisted Latino populations which do they possess. Right here off the bat, when we talk about median income, we see at the very end, under the unlisted category, that the aggregate income for unlisted Latinos, right, is much, much lower than the aggregate income for unlisted non-Hispanics that are African American and white. Registered unlisted Hispanics earn $23,000 and $18,000 less on average than non-Hispanic peers. Right, so there's a real deficit in politically relevant resources for people who are unlisted. When we look at the partisan breakdown among the Latino population, right, so here's the ANES 2012 with 457 Latinos. Nearly 50% of all Latinos in that sample are Democrat. And we go all the way to the bottom of the first column, right, we see that 50% of Latinos are Democrat and 37% of that slice is politically invisible. Right, political invisibility, if we go down from the last row all the way to the end, right, is most localized in the people who identify as independent and unaligned, which is accurate with, sort of people falling through the cracks of the party structure, right? People not being socialized by the political parties, of course, to make a decision and, and all this, right? So the rates are pretty high. Now, the last thing that I want to leave you with in this section is what happens when we split the Latino sample by gender and we split it up by age. Right. The main finding here is that Latino males ages 18 to 40, Latino males under 40, right, their rate of being classified politically invisible is about 60%. Right? Now that's in contrast to the rate among Latinas. 9 plus 7, what, that's 16%, right? So Latinos are with it, number one, right? Latino males, again, are falling through the cracks. Right? And we're wondering who represents this category among Latinos. We see that Latino males are heavily disadvantaged. Now, this last slide here describes the percent in age group listed as mislisted or unlisted. Here, basically, what I just want to give you a quick notes version for is that Latino males ages 18 to 39, right, their rate of political invisibility is 2.5%. Contrast that to the rate among Latinas, ages 18 to 39, that's 40%. Right, which is still high, of course, but it's within the neighborhood of the percentage of political visibility in other age groups. Right, so we have a real Latino male problem in terms of who's left out, whose information is incorrect, right? And here, what we are wondering is how we can fix this. So here we have another palate cleanser, Tafoya. All right, wow, this evidence, oh my God. So we were really intrigued when we found this. We're like, what do we do with this? Right, so by definition, the population that is politically invisible is hard to reach, right? So they're not going to appear clearly in nationally representative surveys. So part two, what we did is, we broke it down and kept it simple. Like, okay, well, let's look at focus group methodology. Right, what we did here is rely on the networks available to us at DePaul University. DePaul University being on the north side of Chicago, it draws many students, many first-generation students from the south and west side of Chicago, also from the suburbs, right? And we created a focus group session. I mean, you can see the flyer here that we used to recruit students. Here's a focus group talking about political culture of Latinx students in Chicago. Right, we really wanted to be able to pick their minds, pick their brains about what some of these experiences were happening. Now, it says that the focus group's March 2023. It was actually earlier this year, 2020. Right, with this methodology, our first assumption is that the politically visible are hard to read, difficult to serve. Right, so of course we we wanted to get to know sort of a handful, with the qualitative research on that end. Those interviews are very rich, very deep, right? This three-step procedure is focused around employing respondent-driven sampling to recruit the politically invisible, right? And then later on, we have a proposed program of work to be able to get to this hard-to-reach population and sort of interventions that we are going to try to do. The goal is learning how the target population perceives political participation and what prevents participants from registering to vote and casting the ballot. So when we were recruiting people who are participating in our study, one of our criteria was, did you vote before? We're looking for people who had never voted, right? And of course, voting is a socially desirable outcome. So many people were like apprehensive, but as soon as they heard that we were giving away $50 gift cards, they were like, oh yeah, I haven't voted. Me. So yeah, we had a handful of people that came. We had 5 students that came. It was a very rich discussion. We had some basic questions, basic information, interest in U.S. politics, mobilization experiences, participation with non-electoral participation, knowledge about the elections, and all this business. Our focus group was successful, and we largely attribute that to the wide reach of our flyer, of our recruitment literature, right? One of the things we wanted to do was identify folks from across the Chicagoland region. Right, so we had 5 participants, and we had 10 people fill out the questionnaire. Like, okay, this is my zip code. Here they are mapped in a Google Maps version of Chicago. Right, the idea is that we wanted a group of people that provided sort of a span of the Chicagoland region, particularly the folks on the south side, right on Cicero, going down to Bridgeview. Those are dense Latino areas. Right, so the idea is that each of those individuals will introduce us to 5 other individuals. Rather than 5 other women. Now, this is a little crazy because, I'm going to go a little bit down. What we're trying to do is we're trying to get up to 500, right? We want to interview, so we're going to do that until we get to 500. Right, and along the way, we are going to be collecting metadata about the size. We also intend to conduct field experiments with an N of 2,000, right? What we are wanting to do is identify the politically invisible population. Now, of course, we're going to use RDS, but we've also identified random digit dialing as a potential, tool, right, to be able to get at people whose voter registration information is not listed. Right. The good thing I also want to say, the reason we're collaborating with colleagues from Japan is because they have new lives. They have the resources, right? My colleague Rumiko Takahashi just received a grant from the Japan Society for Political Methodology, the amount of $175,000 to do this. Right there, over there at her university, the way they study American politics and political behavior, they're excited that the outcome of this research is going to provide insights, right, to how other communities of color function in American politics. Right. I see that I've gone for quite a bit already, so I'm going to skip part 2. Here's another palate cleanser. I was gonna we could talk about this later, right? But I was involved also in gathering data from a GOTV campaign. I worked with the People's Lobby for the Illinois presidential primary. And what we did is we attempted to mobilize voters, right, for the primary earlier this year. These are the dense Latino areas, right, as delineated by state house district. There's a negative correlation between high Latino density in voting, right? So most of the dense Latino areas have the lowest voting rates, right? And here what we wanted to do is, really test out the efficacy of the tools that are hitting the field right now, right? Like how effective was this campaign? This campaign's intention is to reach all voters in Cook County. Even still, we have disadvantages in reaching Latino populations, right? In high Latino areas, there was less contact. And here, of course, we assume because they are mislisted, their information is incorrect. Actually, I want to say this before I end. I found my voting record in their data, right? I found my voting record, right? And it was like Tafoya with my address, right? It was like male, female, or whatever. And then the phone number that was listed there for them to call me to remind me to vote was not my phone number. It was my dad's cell phone number. Now, my dad and I, we share the same first name, the same last name, but he doesn't have a middle name and I do. That middle name came out, but I still have my dad's phone number listed for Cook County data. My dad lives in LA, right? So that information is right from market research. Off the bat, I'm a Latino immigrant 40. I fall under the politically invisible necessity, right? So what we're trying to do, we're working with data that has, 800,000 observations. We're trying to identify where the incorrects are listed, right? And our hypothesis is that the reason why we have such low Latino voting and low Latino outreach in high Latino areas is because these records are outdated. These records are incorrect, right? If we're looking for some cultural explanations about why might this happen, off the bat, Latino households tend to be multi-generational, right? So you'll have child, parent, grandparent living under one roof. The son is named after the dad, the dad's named after the grandpa, right? So they have the same name, right? So what you'll have in Cook County is 3 people appearing in the same address with the same name. Whose phone number appears first is the phone number that all 3 will. Right. So again, we need to be able to have a system to update these records. Lastly, the key takeaways. There are issues with politically relevant resources. Of course, males, which is 18 to 40, are predominantly affected. More importantly, this is what I want to leave you with. This population is reachable. Right. We just have to think about different ways to get at it. Right. Our program of work seeks to contact Latino young adults to determine what it would take to cast the ballot for the first time. Luckily for us in Illinois, there are various reforms that allow voters to register the same day when they go vote. Right? Our intention is to mobilize the youth so that they can make themselves known to the political system. When they cast a ballot, they're going to make sure that their information is correct. Therefore, the voter file will get updated. And all that market research stuff can go out the door. Right? So yeah, here we go. Thank you so much. It's been a great time here. I hope I didn't go over. Yeah, I did go over a little bit, but it was a really good time. Thank you. Thank you so much, guys. All right. I'm now excited if I have any questions.
Yes, will you help me with the, okay. Thanks for your patience, everyone. What I'd like to do is invite those of you in the online audience to please post questions directly in the chat. And I'm also moderating questions to the audience that's here in person. And what I will do is take questions back and forth between the online and the in-person audience. And when the in-person audience asks a question, I will post it inside of the chat so that the folks online can see the questions that are being asked. And I will read aloud the questions that online guests are asking so that the folks in person will have a sense of what's being asked here. Okay, so online folks, welcome, thank you. Please post your questions in the chat, directly in the chat. And then I will turn to my colleagues here in the room and invite them to offer questions.
I also welcome any kind of feedback, right?
Yeah.
So you can also have a statement, you know.
Question or comment?
I really like the presentation, and not something I've ever thought about before. When addressing the voter registration and the idea of what we need to do to mobilize the voters. So I didn't.
The question from the audience in person or comment was just an appreciation of the study and the focus on mobilization. And Professor Tafoya's response was, can you say it again? And I'll mute it now.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, so I thank you for that appreciation. You know, as a scholar that comes from, you know, from the marginalized community, right, we are constantly thinking of ways to innovate, right, of ways to capture people that have fallen through the cracks, right? And I think the literature so far has done an amazing job of describing to us what's important. You know, here I'm sort of, you know, trying to bring in new factors into the conversation.
Great because I grew up in Tafoya, and my dad is a lawyer there, so had like those great discussions like this. Stuff like this. This was one of like the most recent topics about like why Latinos do not get as involved as politics. And you know, I think it's really great. Right now I'm doing an internship about community, you know, registering people to vote. So not specifically Latinos, but like all people. And I wanted to ask about what advice will you give young Latinos to like get to be politically?
Thank you so much. That is a very important question. And I appreciate the effort that you are investing, right? And, you know, seeing your community be a part of the process much greater, right? It seems like it comes a lot from your own personal experience. Yeah, so I guess I would say that, you know, we need to move away from this narrative that Latinos are deficient, that there are cultural sort of explanations describing why we don't like participatory politics, you know, why, you know, we are somehow, you know, just like not living up to the American idea, right? Of course, there are people who are apathetic. There are people who are cynical, you know, but I'll say that I think the institutional constraints, right, you know, sort of determine that behavior. Right? A lot of it, you know, for example, the electoral college, right? In places like California, Democrats will win and Republicans won't, right? In Texas, it's the opposite, right? And so people get dismayed, right? So I think we can, you know, confidently, you know, put, you know, some of that blame on the institutional constructs, right, that are there. In addition, you know, I have worked with Melissa Michelson a great deal, and I would say that her approach and her colleagues' approach, the co-author's approach toward voting is that of it being a social process, right? Typical, you know, the way I was taught to teach public opinion, right, and political participation from conventional political science was that it was a cost-benefit calculation, right? That people were doing those calculations individually, seeing how it would affect the individual's pocketbook or the individual's well-being. You know, I think that if we shift the awareness of voting from an individual action to a collective action, and how our community, you know, can provide what people need, you know, we can totally get there. I guess maybe the one thing that I'm trying to say is that, yeah, we need to see it as a collective action, you know, as a behavior that our community can do collectively. So we move from voting as being a solitary to being a you know, more participatory process. The last thing I'll say is that the lived civics literature describes that you know, people don't need to know everything about politics. You know, folks, if anything, all they have to do is realize like, hey, I know enough, right? I have the right to vote. And exercising it is gonna make me feel as if I'm a part of something good. Right, and we just need to instill that, you know, that confidence, right? Many people aren't doing the ask, right? So you and your group doing that, you know, for many people, it will be the first time we do this, right? That's something that our community really needs. Thank you, Mia. Yeah.
So you guys did noted that specifically Latino members of the community, consider us what would your advice be? It's going to say this question, but what would your advice be to that specific population? And maybe even that you.
Really great question. Yeah, yeah, I was talking, you know, talking to the two of you right before this presentation, about how Latinos are killing it, right? Classrooms in political science, especially for me in Chicago, right, are filled with Latinos. You know, there is clearly a gender gap or a gender difference in terms of who's being involved, right? So, you know, we need to start thinking about gender differences in our community, what's happening to Latino men, what are the incentives that are motivating them to, you know, maybe work a 9-to-5 job versus going to higher ed, right? Now voting, if we think of voting, you can think about it as an institution, right? When you decide to go vote, to register to vote and go to a polling place to vote, right? Political participation defined by some of the classic literature, you know, means that you are engaging in a process of conflict resolution. More importantly, you're rejecting violence as a way to succeed, right? As a way to achieve your ends. Now, I'm not saying that there's no matter or violent or any of that stuff, but like, you know, when we affix our minds to political participation, we are basically adopting the norms, you know, the behaviors, right? And so, if anything, we need to increase the sense of incorporation, the sense of belonging in America. Yeah, and I think that would take us a long way. Right, so Melissa Michelson is currently working on a project on the effect of good feelings. You know, what happens if you tell someone like, hey, feel good about who you are, not about what you're missing. You know, and you know, I think there's a lot to.
So we're gonna invite you to read the question from the chat so that everyone can hear you.
Oh, thank you.
The first question here is by Kanisha Wright, if you want to read this.
Yes, thank you. This is a great presentation. Thanks. First, for 2 questions. What are some of the takeaways from the focus group discussions that have taken place? What have folks shared related to perceptions of politics? Professor Tafoya mentioned random digit dialing can provide more detail. As on what he has in mind. Random digit dialing can provide more details on what he has in mind. What's her name?
Kanisha Wright.
Kanisha. Professor Wright, thank you very much for the question, a very thoughtful question. The focus group interviews were a listening session for us, just a couple of and I, we had a coordinator, and we were probing students for different, the relationship with different topics about politics. I think the thing that struck me the most, the biggest takeaway, was the students' sort of dissatisfaction with the lack of unity. Right, there was, you know, they talk about these various differences, right? You know, some Latinos, you know, were voting Republican, right, and had all these reasons, and they were rejecting their identity. You know, there were other folks that not only were they apathetic and cynical, but they were like telling others to be apathetic and cynical. And you know, you're not cool if you don't hate politics. Right? So it can be really hard to feel connected to a community when, you know, your own community can be kind of like fragmented and separated, right? So I think that one thing that will be important in the future is developing a broader sense, right, of what it means to be kind of, what it means to be connected to a Latino, Hispanic population. In Chicago, we're dealing with the migrant crisis, right? Migrants that are robust from Texas and Florida to Chicago, right? And they're largely from Venezuela and from Colombia. Now, I've supported leaders in the Mexican American community, folks who were responsible for starting the 2006 walkouts, and then there were some legislators from the Mexican legislature that I talked to as well. My interest was in getting the youth involved in providing relief work, right? running soup kitchens, right? For example, for people who were in need coming, from Colombia, Venezuela. And what surprised me the most was their, not only like their distaste for it, they were like, no, like that's their problem. That's a Venezuelan problem. That's a Colombian problem. We need to worry about migrantes. We need to worry about us, right? And that really put a sour taste in my mouth. Right? I was attempting to foment this connectedness, right? That all Latinos that can share this immigrant background, right? What it's like to be in a new country and establish yourself for the first time in your family, and for home to be so far away, and in Chicago it's so freaking cold. How do you deal with that, right? We need to be connected now more than ever. There's a lot of disunity that I think we need to challenge. Now, if you're a devil's advocate, you could also say, well, being Mexican, being Puerto Rican, being Cuban, being Dominican, that's like essential to who I am. Maybe Latino or Latin or Latinx isn't, right? Then if that's true, then, I think we need to develop a bit of a worldly identity, right? If we're going to be representatives of those countries in another country, then we need to develop an international perspective, right? And so that could be a different way. I think it's going to take, civics, it's going to take connectedness, it's going to take all these things, right, for us to develop a sense of. And then I also remembered the point about random digit dialing. Yeah. Right. So in a lot of survey research, particularly there were big questions about the Cooperative Congressional Election Study, who uses online samples, right? They'll have a sample of 65,000. Those folks took the survey from home on their computer. Of course, there is a disparity as to who has a computer and who doesn't, right? So those populations will look different. That's why the CCES or the CES now, as it is known, has so many observations, right? 65,000, we match them to the census to get a good sampling frame and all that. Random digit dialing is something that is primarily used by the Pew Research Center. Mark Hugo Lopez, who was the one who ran the Pew Hispanic Center, and I think it has gone through a name change right now, talks about random digit dialing as being a pretty awesome tool that, it's unfortunate that a lot of surveys are moving away from. Now, it is a little bit intensive, right? We do have to get a machine, to randomize the digits of the phone number, but there's a lot of information contained in the phone, like the area code, general region, right? And so, our thought is that we might be able to get a comprehensive sample of the politically invisible, or at least, maybe oversample Latino males under 40 in Chicagoland, right? By using the area codes, by using the information contained in the phone number, and that will allow us to circumvent issues with sample coverage here, right? So, we're excited about that, and with some of this money that we got, we're going to commission a random digit dialing poll, in Chicagoland, and hopefully be able to expand to the rest of the Illinois. Yeah, thank you very much for that question. Did I get all of it?
Yeah.
All right. A question from Professor Pedraza. Which public policies, administrative rules, or bureaucratic practices do you see increasing rates of political invisibility? Ooh. What about those that reduce political invisibility? Oof. Thank you for asking that question. I say oof. Because, it's become clear nowadays, right, that the United States, because of its partisan divide, right, because the Republican Party dominates in some areas and the Democrats dominate in others, it's become clearer now than ever that, there is a bifurcated life experience for those of us living in the U.S. Those of us in Republican states, are, seeing a right to vote threatened, and of course, access to reproductive healthcare, right, all these things, and let alone the attack on higher education, the attack on tenure that's happening in many places, right? And so in those places, I, got my PhD in Texas. I was, witnessing the governor, right, or the Secretary of State, deliberately closing polling places, right, in Houston, in Harris County, limiting the drop-off ballot, the drop-off areas for the ballots, right, purging voters rolls, right. So I think that all these practices, Carol Anderson describes it, New York Times bestseller book, One Person No Vote, that since 2008, Republicans, instead of expanding their constituency, have become devoted in limiting the right to vote for Democrats, right? So that is very clearly, at least in my mind, it's undemocratic, It's un-American, you know, I get personally excited living in Chicago because it is an excellent example of a multiracial democracy. We have a third of the population that's white, a third that's black, and a third that's Latino. Right, and how do those three, you know, it's like these three objects floating in space, how do they gravitate around each other? There is a lot of bargaining, there's a lot of, yeah, a lot of figuring out, and I think along the process, we get to know each other. We get to grow more tolerant of each other. And of course, the right to vote there, I think, is pretty essential because we all just want accurate snapshots of what the population looks like in government. Now, I'll say in terms of policies, initiatives, there are states like California, I think Illinois, New York adopted it more recently, automatic registration, right? You know, where people, I think, as soon as they turn 18, they'll join the voter roll. And if you don't want to be a part of it, you can opt out. Right, so that's pretty cool, right? You know, if you hate it, like never mind. Okay, that's you. There's also automatic voter registration. Same day registration. That's pretty awesome. That's pretty awesome. You don't have to, you know, do it like 3 weeks before the election. You can just show up on that day with your ID and just add yourself to the list. I think that maybe the biggest thing that will matter is that an individual should be able to verify their own information. Right, you put your, you know, you register, right? You know, someone will take your ID, put down your address, you know, put down your birth date or whatever. More importantly, your phone number, right? And how you can be reached, right? So if you have a hand that information going in, I think that's going to be more when it's passed on to campaigns to the water fund. Yeah, that's all for now. I don't know if there are any other ideas that come to mind. Yeah, but we definitely, I don't know, we might even need a national law for voter registration. You know, we might even need like, you know, congressional resources to vote to this problem. Yeah. I'm hoping to get like thousands of dollars from the Democratic Party. I know they spent a lot of money here in Arizona, right? You know, re-electing Cortez Masto in Nevada, and was it the governor here? Something like that, right? We needed a rush of Democrats for the 2022 midterm. And it worked because Democrats spent, it was like over $20 million in Spanish language ads, particularly radio ads. Right? Apparently, here's a quick statistic that I showed in the classes. Apparently, Spanish language radio reaches 98% of all Hispanic households. So like, wow, get it out there, you know, get it in Spanish, right? Really yell at them, hey, ponte a votar. That's something work. Yeah.
You know, I worked in Alzheimer's research before coming to this department at another department, ASU, and we did our ads for our research studies over the radio.
Yeah, that's
on Spanish radio, and that's how we got a lot of our participants.
Wow, I love that. Yeah, we need to be savvier about where we put that money. Yeah.
All right. We are at time, and we know that the spaces get reserved for classroom use and other events, and so I want to be mindful of colleagues that may have or need access to this space. Please join me in thanking, for those of you who are online, perhaps to share a message, and for those of you in the audience with a round of applause. Thank you, Professor Joseph Tafoya, for joining us today. Great. Thank you, Kanisha.
Yeah. Awesome.